Once again, we have another quadratic equation. So it is an equation, it is equal to something, and to solve a quadratic equation, we must ensure that it is equal to 0, and it is equal to 0. So our statement would look like this. It is already in the factorized form, so we will say either 4x plus 3 equals 0 or 2x plus 3 equals 0. We now have two two-step equations to solve. So I minus 3 from this side, which means I minus 3 from this side as well, and I get 4x equal to minus 3. I divide both sides by 4, so I get that x is equal to minus 3 over 4. That's one of the two answers. The second answer, I minus 3 from this side, and I get that 2x is equal to minus 3, and I divide both sides by 2. So my second answer is that x is equal to minus 1.5, and I must state it exactly like this, showing both answers to get full marks. Let us now look at another quadratic equation. However, this quadratic equation has not been factorized for us. Now, to solve a quadratic equation, it must be equal to 0, and this quadratic equation is equal to 0. But in order to solve it, we have to first factorize it, which is why we learned how to factorize equations. So we're going to look for the factors of AC that add to B. And AC in this case, AC in this case is A is 1, B is minus 3, and C is 2. So AC is 2 and B is minus 3. So we could take minus 1 multiplied by minus 2, and when we add that, we'll get minus 3. Since A is 1, we can go straight into x minus 1, x minus 2. Because A is 1, we can just take these factors and put them straight into the bracket. So x minus 1, x minus 2, and that is equal to 0 because it is a quadratic equation. Since the equation is equal to 0, we can now attempt to solve it as I've just shown you. So our statement would be either x minus 1 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. We add 1 to both sides, which gives us that x is equal to 1. We add 2 to both sides, which gives us that x is equal to 2. So the solution to this equation would be either x equal 1 or x equal 2. And we must state both to get the marks. Okay, so here we now have a quadratic equation and it is equal to 0. So when we look at it, we see a difference and we see squares. So if we were to factorize that, and this is why we learned these things from before, if we were to factorize that, we know the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 16 is 4, and we know that one bracket would be plus and the other bracket would be minus, and we put that equal to 0 because this is the question given to us. We have a quadratic equation and it is equal to 0. Once we have it in the factorized form, we can now say either x plus 4 equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. So in this one, we would minus 4 from both sides, and we'll get that x is equal to minus 4. And in this one, we would add 4 to both sides, and we will get that x is equal to positive 4. And that will be our solution to this question, stating both solutions to get full marks. Here is another example of a quadratic equation. Now, because you've learned how to solve complicated quadratic equations, sometimes you forget how to solve simple quadratic equations. So to solve a quadratic equation, the equation must be equal to 0. On this question, the equation is equal to 0. Now, you've learned how to find a by c, etc. But in this case, c is 0. So the factorization of it is much simpler. What is common? X is common, and we're left with x minus 2 equals 0. And voila, the quadratic equation has been factorized. A very simple factorization in this case. Now we can go to solving it. Either x equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. The first one is solved already, but this one we need to add 2 to both sides, so we'll get that x is equal to 2. So our two answers are either x equals 0 or x equal 2, and you must write those words either and or. This is exactly how you would lay out your statement to get full marks. Okay, let's have a look at yet another example. This is a quadratic equation and it is equal to 0. So we are going to attempt to solve this quadratic equation that is equal to 0. So A is 1, which means we can use the shortcut. B is minus 10 and C is 25. So let's see if we want the factors of AC that add to B. And AC in this case is 25 and B is minus 10. So let's see, minus 5 multiplied by minus 5, that will give us minus 25, and when we add them we will get minus 10. So using the shortcut method, we'll get that x minus 5 by x minus 5 is equal to 0. We notice the two brackets are the same, which means that this is a perfect square. This is really x minus 5 squared equal to 0. When we have a perfect square, it is the only time that we are not going to get two answers for our quadratic equation, because it will plain and simply be, for this to be equal to 0, it must mean that x minus 5 must be equal to 0. We add 5 to both sides and we will get that x is equal to 5. So x equal 5 would be our solution for this equation. Okay, here once again we have an example of yet another quadratic equation that we're trying to solve. So the first thing we do is we check to make sure that the equation is equal to 0. To solve a quadratic equation, the quadratic equation must be equal to 0. So let's go. First thing we have to do is factorize. So we're looking for the factors of AC that add to B. So A by C would give us minus 30, and B, because A is 5, B is minus 13, and C is minus 6. This is why we spend time learning how to factorize quadratics. So B is minus 13. So what are the factors of minus 30 that add to minus 13? And I think if we say minus 15 by 2, if we add that, we do get minus 13. So A is not 1, so we cannot use the shortcut method, so we use the long way. We get 5x squared, and the minus 13 now becomes minus 15x plus 2x minus 6 equals 0. We see what's common with the first two and what's common with the second two. The greatest common factor, highest common factor here is 5x, and we're left with x minus 3. The greatest common factor here is positive 2, and we're left with x minus 3. Being very careful with our signs. X minus 3 is now common with both, so we take out x minus 3, and we're left with 5x plus 2 equals 0. We now have the quadratic equation equal to 0 in the factorized form. Because it's in the factorized form, we now simply say either x minus 3 equals 0 or 5x plus 2 equals 0. We add 3 to both sides and we'll get that x is equal to 3. We minus 2 from this side, and we'll get that 5x is equal to minus 2, and we divide both sides by 5. So x is equal to minus 2 over 5. And we have to state both solutions with the words either and or to get full marks for this question. So just to recap, to solve a quadratic equation, we must make sure it is equal to 0. We then factorize it and then solve it from the factorized form.